All right, everyone. Well, if you've ever done psychedelics, which if you listening to this podcast, you probably have, you've probably listened to music while doing those psychedelics, and you've probably had some thoughts along the lines of, man, this music sounds way different and so much more important and so critical to this whole like psychedelic experience that I'm having right now. And today's guest, Mendel Kaelen, has taken that and probably gone further with it than anyone else that I'm aware of. He did his PhD at Imperial College London, where he studied the impact that music has on psychedelic therapy outcomes. And later on, he went on to found the company Wavepaths, where he's currently the CEO. Wavepaths is a software company that makes generative technologies, or generative music technologies, rather, to be used in the course of psychedelic therapy. He's an awesome sonic wizard, and I'm pleased to have him as today's guest on the podcast. So thank you, Mendel, for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Brom. Really a pleasure.
Absolutely. So, it's interesting. Music and psychedelics is such a seemingly seductive concept. I invested in WavePass through my fund, and on the pitch deck for my fund, I have this slide that lists all the companies we've invested in, and it just says the name of the company and then like a one-sentence description. So it says like WavePass, music for psychedelic therapy. And every time I show someone this pitch deck, I'm not even kidding, people look at that page and the first thing they say is, tell me more about the company that does the music. It's like everyone wants to know about that. There's something about this idea of music and psychedelics. It seems like so obvious, but it wasn't always obvious, right? So how did you sort of have this intuition or understanding that this was something that was actually worth like dedicating a career to and studying in detail?
Right. There's a bit of a funny twist there, my own career getting where I am right now. And that is that although I am a musician and I've been making music for all of my life, and I got interested in psychedelics about 15 years ago when I was 20 years old, I never really made that connection that strongly until I was already working at Imperial. And that moment happened by seeing a photograph of Johns Hopkins University doing a psychedelic therapy session. And I saw the patient lying on a couch with headphones and an eye mask. And suddenly there was a light switch in my brain that went off. And I realized that music is almost the only stimulus that patients are exposed to during these drug effects. Right? They are barely speaking, at least not for continuous long periods of time, depending, of course, the process that someone is on. But music is almost the only stimulus present during the peak duration of these effects. And it really baffled me that no one was looking into this. There's no modern research. At that point, there was no modern research looking into this. So this is where the journey began, the academic journey began, is studying how psychedelics and music work together in the brain and all of that. And for me personally, it allowed me to merge two really big passions in my life, which is music and psychedelics. And in the psychedelic, I sometimes jokingly say, in the psychedelic community, people refer to me as the music guy. But then when I go to music conferences, people refer to me as the drug guy. and I really have my feet in both worlds. And Wavepaths was really born out of me go into this, but many of these realizations that came out of the research, basically.
Gotcha. So I definitely want to talk about WavePaths more, but I think that starting off, just talking a bit more about what you learned and what you uncovered in your academic research would be a good place to start. Like, what were some of the highlights of things that you discovered in your academic career, and especially like anything that maybe kind of surprised you or that was a little bit unintuitive, if there's anything like that?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think when you are starting to do research that has never been done before, everything is a big surprise in a way. Right? Because you will not expect necessarily to see the results that you're seeing, as opposed to replicating previous research, which of course is a golden standard in academia as well. So there's a number of highlights. I would say the neuroimaging studies we've done were pretty interesting. We basically had people listen to music in an MRI scanner while being on or off LSD in this case. And then we decomposed the soundtrack into the different compositional and acoustic features. So that allowed us to look at how the brain is processing the different acoustic properties in music. So rhythm, key changes, the timbral components, the amount of dissonance in the music, you name it. and look at how the brain is processing these soberly and then how that's different under LSD. And what we found there was really interesting. We saw that under the influence of LSD, a huge amount of resources are being allocated to processing the tone color in the sound of the music. And that happened specifically in areas specialized in language. So a lot of ideas and theories came out of that. But the idea that tone color and that the brain is allocating more attentional resources, one may say, to process tone color more under a psychedelic, we were not expecting that to see. But of course, when you start thinking about it and reading about it, you have a very beautiful story there. And there's a lot of angles to this, but tone color, which in essence is defined as all those harmonic qualities in music that are not pitch or not volume, is used by us all the time to differentiate different voices. It's used by babies before we are born into this world to differentiate voices of different caregivers in their environment already. It's used to differentiate between different musical instruments, and it's the primary modality by which emotion is communicated. So that the brain is processing this more under a psychedelic, of course, fitted the already narrative we were building through previous research that the subjective experience, more broadly speaking, is so intensified in a psychedelic state. That was one thing. Another thing, when we did more clinical research and we were interviewing patients about their experience of the music, which I found really interesting to notice, is the language choice that patients had when they referred to the music. They talked about the music as if they were held by the music, as if the music was listening to them, as if the music was holding them, carrying them, transporting them, reassuring them, almost as if it's a human being that they are in communication with. And this led to the idea that music itself is some kind of third therapist in the room. Yeah, there's much more to say on this, but these are a few important highlights I would like to say that really led to what is now Wavepaths.
The tone color thing especially is very interesting. I mean, I personally get very strong synesthesia when I do psychedelics, and a lot of that synesthesia seems to be driven by the music that I'm listening to. Like, and depending on, as you said, the tone color, you will see like very different colors or patterns like in the closed eye visuals. And it does seem like the tone color has a more dominant effect than, say, the tempo of the music, or like the drum pattern. It's more about like, how does that snare drum sound? How does that kick drum sound? That really drives that like closed eye synesthesia. So that's pretty interesting. And I'm curious, like, a lot of those studies that I know that you've done were sort of comparing like different types of music and how people respond to like different types. How universal is the idea of like good music for psychedelics versus bad music for psychedelics? I mean, obviously there's something to do with patients' preferences and everything.
Yeah.
But can we sort of say generally that this is the type of music that you'd want, and maybe this is the type of music you would want for the come up versus the peak versus the come down?
Yes. Well, so yes, let me dissect that question.
Yeah, it's a big one. Sorry.
It's a big one, but it's of course exactly what we're studying. So I would love to again highlight a few of these insights there. The more we do this research, and the listeners need to understand that the reason why Wavepaths was founded was to double down on more research and more understanding on the effects of music and psychedelics in combination. But the more we do this work, the more we conclude that there is no such thing as a universal best music for the psychedelic experience. That in a way, music is like language, and we all speak a different mother tongue, and depending on where the country that you were born in. And in the same way, we all have a different musical personality based on the different musical genres and styles we have built identity attachments with in our teenage years and our early adulthood, and you name it. So this is already a finding in the work that I did at Imperial, is you can sometimes have one song, exactly the same song, that can facilitate a total life-changing experience for one individual, but can lead to a nightmare experience and potentially a counter-therapeutic experience for another individual. So trying to understand that better and predict what music resonates better for people is exactly what we're doing. But then having said that, if you zoom out for a moment, you talk about different phases, right, in the psychedelic experience. You have the pre-onset where you wait for the effects, the onset when the effects kick in, the peak where the effects are at its most intense, and then the return to baseline consciousness. There's definitely some conclusions we can make on kind of what music is best fitting in general for these different phases, because different functions, different needs are present in these different phases. Right? In the beginning, there's a greater emphasis on reassurance and safety. In the peak, you may want to actually help the listener to confront difficult experiences to do the therapeutic work. Whereas in the return phase, you may want to ensure that the individual feels grounded and present in one's body and able to gradually start to have a conversation with the therapist and all of that. But yeah, the more we do this work, the more we conclude that there is no such thing as the perfect playlist or the perfect soundtrack for psychedelic experiences.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. So if someone was designing a playlist, obviously they should just be using Wavepaths, but hypothetically, calming safety music at the beginning, transitioning into maybe more intense music to help the confrontation, and then
in general, yeah. But then there are footnotes as well, because the same music for one individual could be really helpful and therapeutic. That individual itself is also on a journey, session by session, right? So there are the musical preferences, but there's also the process the individual is on, and what music needs to support that process, which is very dynamic within the session, and then also from session to session. So yeah, there's no, and this is, I hate to say this because people always want to have a fixed kind of simple protocol to follow, but there's a real art to music selection, and this is, of course, what we're trying to solve and kind of simplify for therapists.
that makes sense. So let me ask you this then. This is maybe a follow-up question. If it is so personalized, if you go back to some of the, the ancient traditions of the, Shipibo shamans or whatever, oftentimes their psychedelic work is done in a group setting, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So what is the idea of like music, the importance of personalization? How does that translate into this idea of like a group session? Does this mean that maybe group sessions are not optimal and that people should be doing these things kind of as solo journeys, or what do you think?
Right. So there's a few things there. I think group sessions have their benefits and their challenges. And there's definitely things we can borrow from traditional use as well, but also things we should not borrow with that immediacy. Because these practices have been formed in a very specific time and location. Right? And the music also created in that context is very specific for that time and that culture. Doesn't mean that some of us may not be able to find great resonance with the music when we are taking part in these traditional settings. In fact, there's something in those songs that make them very fitting, needless to say, for these psychedelic experiences. But they are, needless to say, specific for that time and culture. So that's one thing. When it comes to how shamans make music in these traditional contexts, and I'm saying this both from studying anthropology as well as having lived in the Amazon jungle as a 20-year-old kid experiencing ayahuasca for a number of months, is yes, there is...
You went to Amazon when you were 20 to do ayahuasca? Wow.
Yes. Yeah, a deep dive in the my early adulthood for sure. Yeah. Yes, and I learned great things there as well. And one of the things I witnessed so clearly is that, yes, there is an adaptation to the group, maybe more to the individual at times, but also, of course, dependent on what tradition and what ceremonies we're talking about. But shamans would, at times, sing a song for an individual, like call an individual to his or her space, or walk towards the individual, kneel down, and sing a song after a diagnosis specific for this individual. So there's a lot of personalization that is still happening, I would dare to say. But again, shamanism is this huge umbrella term, and it basically applies to many different traditions around the world. And there's many different kind of tweaks to that as well.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, these the Shipibo shaman are not pulling up a Spotify playlist and pressing play, right? They're actually performing something, probably doing lots of improvisation around these sort of core themes. So you could say that they are basically doing generative music as well, and kind of somewhat customized to the group, maybe to the individual at times. Yeah, so
totally,
that makes sense.
In fact, and these songs are often gifted to them through interaction in their worldview with the plant spirits. So many, many years of work to become a shaman in the village that you live in. And in that work, you are gifted songs that are related to a specific plant. And the ways the shamans I work with refer to these songs are almost like a telephone number. So you dial a specific telephone number to call on the spirit of this plant that you want to do the healing work with. No matter what you think of the kind of metaphysical belief systems around that, we can just park that entirely. But this idea of an essence that is related to a song that you get equipped with, that you have a very deep relationship with, and that you can then work with, and to your point, improvise with in a live setting with the client you're working on, is very central to their work.
Yeah. And you talk about the telephone number thing, and that might sound, kind of crazy to someone who's like firmly rooted in, the Western world. But I mean, I've been in situations where like the shaman plays a specific song and everyone just immediately throws up. It's like there's something about that song that makes people need to purge. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And so whether that's a spirit or whether that's some sort of, just pure brain chemistry thing, there's certainly something to be said about the idea that like very specific songs can evoke certain emotions, even if you had no sort of pre-programming to associate that song with the specific emotion. There's just something about the tone color, maybe the melody that makes it happen. That brings up another question, actually, that I've been wanting to ask you. I've had some debates with people on this idea of, is it useful to have songs that the patient is familiar with in the playlist? Or should it be all songs that are totally new to the patient? The idea being that, sure, maybe on the one hand, having a familiar song would be comforting, or associated with good memories, but also maybe you're bringing some negative things associated with that song into the playlist or into the psychedelic session. Like, what's sort of your take on that?
Yeah, so if you ask most psychedelic therapists, they would say you want to avoid familiarity as much as possible. You want the music to be novel. You do not want the music to be an anchor for safety too much, because the main invitation is to let go. The main invitation is to explore and be open for novelty in yourself through the music. So if you have a song that is very familiar to you, it can be like a defense mechanism almost of sorts that prevents you to go deeper in your process. So that's a very common notion that you would find in the psychotherapy community. And I think that there's something important about that we see as well in our work. But familiarity can be therapeutic. Like we all have, for example, songs in our life that we have kind of related and connected with specific periods in our life. You may, as a therapist, want to bring in those songs specifically to help people return to specific periods in their lives. So you can do it collaboratively before the session begins. And then also to your point, if you work with specific patient populations, let's say patients with trauma, there can be great benefit actually in some kind of collaborative approach beforehand that kind of makes them feel more in control and more in control. That's the best way to put it, in a balanced way. You may want to do it only at the beginning or at the end, or maybe at the moment of the peak, and have a collaborative process that kind of balances familiarity with novelty. So again, that's also not kind of a black and white scenario, but one of the things we saw so clearly in our work with Imperial, this is really interesting, is that yes, to your point, known songs can have a whole baggage of associations that come with it. And you don't know what associations your client will have with that song. So it's a gamble what will come up when you play a piece that may be very familiar, like Adagio for Strings, which is a beautiful piece of classical music, incredible, but it's used over and over again in advertisements and films and you name it. Henry Gorecki, another example, amazing piece of music. I selected bits of an album by this composer in the first psilocybin playlist I created for Imperial, but then some listeners were familiar with the background of this album, and the background of the album is that it's created in response to processing the Holocaust in Nazi Germany.
Maybe not the best thing to think about.
And it's a pretty dark theme that you're suddenly reminded of. And it can be, if that's part of your process, that can be. But if it's not part of your process, it's a distraction. And there's many more examples that I can give here where we really encourage to have kind of novelty as the basis. On top of that, if you have control over the novelty of the music, the freshness that the music is experienced with, you also create new memories with that music. You create totally unique memories with this totally unique music that you can then leverage and work with therapeutically afterwards. Because then you can gift this new music to the client for continuous processing and reconnection with the experience, integrating the experience in one's daily life, you name it.
That makes sense. Yeah. So I've also personally sort of experienced this where you hear a bunch of new music and then afterwards you're like, man, I got to listen to that song that I
Yes.
listened to during the trip.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
then
it's
of
very
course
common.
you listen to it again and you're like, man, that song sounded way better when I was, right in the peak of the acid. But
Right.
it's still good afterwards. Another controversial discussion topic around music selection for psychedelic therapy, vocals or no vocals.
Yeah, sure.
Did you find anything in your research around people's preferences? I'm
Yes.
personally a no vocals guy for the most
Uh-huh.
part, but I'm curious to know what
Yes.
your
Well,
take is.
exactly. This is a great example of personalizing music because vocals are quite polarizing. Some people find vocals very helpful to feel connected and feel reassured and have a sense of humanity shining through the music. And it's also important to differentiate between vocals with lyrics and without. And it's another thing. But pure vocals without lyrics, some people found them very distracting. And most likely that is because, and this is what we pick up in kind of interviewing patients about their experience, for example, is that vocals will bring in more of a human personality subtly in the session. And suddenly you have this person that joins your session. So that's another gamble in a way. You bring these individuals into your session suddenly. Now, if you can again predict ahead of time if this person resonates with certain female vocal qualities or male vocal qualities, cultural qualities to the voice, you name it, it can be a very powerful tool to make the music really feel more human. It's a bit of an obvious thing to say, but it's one thing that we pick up. Lyrics, on the other hand, so most therapists would recommend against lyrics because using words is engaging a very different type of cognition than you mostly want in a session to happen. Right? You mostly want the focus to be on experiencing, on really being in the moment wherever that music is bringing you. Words are a step away removed from experience. Right? Words are per definition a symbol that points to something, an object or an experience. So by engaging that part of the mind, you may actually remove the individual also more further away from the experience. But again, we also see that this is not a black and white thing. And I think selected lyrics can be incredibly powerful as well, especially when the theme of the lyrics is fitting to the process that the individual is going through.
Yeah, it really sort of speaks to the lyrics can be very sort of directive. And in psychedelic therapies, there's a sort of idea of like there's directive and then there's non-directive therapy, and like lyrics are definitely directive, and I've noticed that this even happens outside of psychedelic therapy context too. Like if I'm doing work or studying, it's very hard for me to listen to any music that has lyrics.
Right. Yeah. Same.
Funny enough, I can listen to music that has lyrics sung in a language I don't understand, and then it almost sounds like an instrument. But if
Yes,
it's
exactly.
English, I can't really get anything done because I just get drawn to whatever the person is saying. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that directive versus non-directive idea, but
well, that's a really good point. Like if the lyrics are in a language you understand, the music becomes more concrete. It becomes more about something. The great thing about instrumental music is it's not about something concrete. Instrumental music conveys a process. Right? So music can convey the process of grief. It can convey the process of letting go or feeling strong or feeling confident or feeling sad. But it's not about grieving for this person or letting go of this thing. It's the process. And if that music then carries you on this experience, your mind, the mind of you, is projecting the concrete content into the musical event. And this is one of the main theories we're working with music and psychedelic therapy. Is music is almost, some dare to say, one of the most ideal therapeutic tools for that reason, because it really harmonizes the balance of providing some form of direction, which is what music is doing, but at the same time some space, some liberty for the mind of the individual to be made visible in the experience of the music and made more expressed and come to the surface more fully, basically.
Yeah, it can definitely push you off in a direction, but still give you lots of leeway. It's kind of like a wind in a certain way, right? Like the wind.
I love that. Yeah, I love that metaphor. And you can change the sails still, right? If you're sailing
right,
in the wind.
You can change. Absolutely, yeah. So Before one last question before we get into Wavepaths, I know that a lot of the research you did at Imperial was using LSD, and I would imagine that the findings with LSD probably carry over to other 5-HT2A agonists like psilocybin. But do we see pretty consistent results whether you're looking at something like LSD or whether you're looking at a drug that has a totally different mechanism of action like ketamine?
Yes, yeah, great question.
Is it pretty similar?
I would say it's more similar than different. So when you look at the brain effects of both, let's say, psilocybin, LSD, and ketamine, they share strong similarities, which is interesting because they are different molecules and they have different kind of neuropharmacological effects. They bind to different receptors. But if you image the brain, they are more similar than different, I would dare to say. In fact, they're pretty consistent if you look at so-called resting state conditions, which is a kind of neuroscientific term to look at what the drug in this case is doing without any stimulus involved. So that's one thing to say. When it comes to the experience of music for these different medicines, this is something we are right now actively studying. And it's too early to disclose anything on that front. But you're right, we have studied LSD. We have studied LSD at Imperial. And now we are actively comparing these different drugs and studying sound and music perception, which will then lead to tailoring choices around acoustic compositional properties to these different medicines. And I would not be surprised if there are some subtle or not so subtle differences between these different medicines that are actually really important to take into effect. Yeah. One really common effect with ketamine, for example, that people experience is this sense of total timelessness, where music becomes more about the harmonics that are there in this moment rather than the journey that the composition is carrying you on. Whereas with psilocybin and MDMA in particular, you hear almost the opposite, right? You're more carried on this movement that music is creating in its progression. So if that's true, you want to think through how you can then best design music for those different experiences and provide the most optimal therapeutic support conditions, basically.
Yeah, I can say that in my own N=1 research, I can confirm those findings. With ketamine, it's like you almost don't hear the music. It's like it just becomes like a texture on the wall. It might as well be like the wall or a painting or something.
Yeah, or you kind of zoom into it almost, where the music becomes invisible. Right? That's another way to put it.
Yeah. And it's like the only time that you notice the music is when it stops playing before the next song comes on. And you're like, oh, there was a song.
Which is also very dose dependent. That's also important to notice. We see the same effects with high dose psilocybin and high dose MDMA experiences. Music also becomes more of a backdrop. And it doesn't mean that the music is not influencing the experience anymore. Right? But it may be doing it more kind of subconsciously without the kind of conscious awareness of the music.
Absolutely. Yeah, interesting stuff. Okay, so on to Wavepaths. So you did your PhD, then you did some postdoc work, right? At what point did you decide, okay, I'm going to switch from academia to actually start a company? Was this something that you always had planned?
No.
Or was there something that kind of happened that made you think, oh, I should commercialize?
I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur, but the more I do this work, the more I realize that this is definitely a pattern in my life, without doubt. So the kind of going through a PhD, near the end of a PhD, and during my kind of postdoc period, kind of 2 years after that, I designed many of the playlists for the clinical trials and worked together with many therapists. And I saw firsthand many times that the most qualified psychotherapists you can think of were really struggling with very important questions about music. What to do if the patient requests the music to stop? What to do if the individual having the experience is saying, please, this music is making me feel so unsafe, or the music is distracting me, or whatever. There's all these different reasons why someone may say, please stop the music. What do you do? What's the best therapeutic response? So this is, of course, where we are really doubling down our studies. But that was for me the main moment, I would say, where I realized there is this huge knowledge gap or expertise gap in this community. And this is where the first ideas of Wavepaths were formed, because I also at the same time have always been really interested in computational creative systems, kind of creative AI, how some people refer to this, building these generative systems that kind of make art, biometrics, the neuroscience of human development, the neuroscience of psychedelics. And the main vision that we had back then was we can actually merge this into one model, one framework, and one technology. But of course, it was another step to then do that, right? And really leave my academic career and really do this. And how that happened was basically realizing that this idea was just keeping me awake at night all the time. I was just totally obsessed with this idea. And I realized that no matter how kind of well kind of designed my academic career was becoming, that I would not have forgiven myself if I would not have tried to create this technology. That was the strength of the creative vision, basically. And then I threw myself off the cliff, basically, symbolically, and learned how to build an airplane on the way down.
Amazing. Yeah, I think that in that unique insight that music is very important for psychedelic therapy, but a lot of therapists are not very good DJs.
Yes.
Is something that people need to kind of realize. So, okay, so for people, let's take a step back. For people that are not necessarily familiar, like what is Wavepaths? Can you just kind of give us the high level overview and maybe what it actually looks like for someone to use the product?
Got it. Yeah. So to put it really short and succinct, we have developed and are developing a framework, a set of understandings and insights that help to make the music better personally resonate with the listener. And then a system that allows to simplify that process, and on top of that, generate live music for the listener that has this experience. And the fact that this is live music created in this moment allows for great flexibility. You can pre-program the music beforehand. You can set the variables and let it run, but you can also take over manually at any point and change the emotional qualities, change the emotional intensity, change the instrumentation without necessarily changing the entire course of the experience for the listener. The next step is integrating biometric information that adds a new level of optimization to this process. But this is what we have developed. It's a platform that creates live music tailored to the medicine and the individual having the experience.
Gotcha. So someone might open up the software and say, here's the drug that I'm doing. Here are my musical preferences.
Exactly.
Here are the types of emotions that I want to process during the trip. And then let me press go. And now there is this soundscape, sort of, for lack of a better word, that's generated. And it guides people through the trip, but it's not static. Like you kind of mentioned that it's generative, which means that the trip sitter or the therapist or even the patient themselves could kind of adjust the emotional intensity, the even emotional direction kind of in real time without like jumping to another Spotify playlist or trying to find another song. Is that kind of
That's correct.
Idea?
Yeah. In the same way that if you would be a shaman singing a song, you would change the intonation of your voice depending on the experience that the listener has. Right? That's a level of immediacy we are creating. And on top of that, one thing that I do like to take a moment to emphasize is, although we use these terms like generative music, one thing that we realized actually more and more is that this idea of generative music, this term generative music, can create a false impression that it's all computer-generated music, which is not fully true. We work with more than 30 different live musicians at the moment, and these musicians, they create the building blocks for what can become a composition. And these can be acoustic instruments of all sorts. These can be electronic instruments of all sorts. And then our system has an inbuilt logic to then merge and remix these components in real time to have a real-time composition of sorts that still is fully live, but also at the same time has a human quality to it. And not have that kind of bland, cold, generative sound to it that actually some other generative apps that are not for psychedelics really have. It's hard to find these systems, I dare to say, that have still that human feel to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I, similar to you, Mendel, I actually grew up in a musical family, and my brother is actually a songwriter in Nashville, like a full-time songwriter producer. I've worked in recording studios, so I feel like I have a better ear for music than the average person does. And when I first heard about Wavepaths, my first thought was, like you said, oh, generative music. It's probably like this sort of corny, like computer generated stuff. And then I heard it, and I was like, oh, this is actually good. This is kind of amazing.
Yes, yeah, great.
And what's amazing, and I hope that at some point you can have, some more demos for people to see, but it's amazing how simple the software is, but still allows like infinite amounts of adjustments if you choose to go that deep into it. So like at a high level, you can just press play on the soundscape and it will guide you through the whole thing. But if you, for example, feel that the music is too intense, you can like press the calm button and it will just seamlessly it'll just like somehow seamlessly transition to this calming music. And then, we were talking about vocals. You can even dig into any song that's being played and say, I actually want to remove the vocals, or I want to remove the drums, or I want to swap out the drums for a different drum. So you can actually like almost like live DJ the whole thing if you want to, or you can just let it play, which is really crazy. I've literally never, I've used Pro Tools, I've used Ableton, I've used Logic, I've used like all these different things, and I've never really come across anything like Wavepaths. It's truly like a one of a kind thing. So yeah, I just like geek out on it because of the music side. It's super cool.
Yeah.
So who is using Wavepaths now? Is it being used mostly by consumers, or is it being used in clinics? Like what sort of, because you guys launched pretty recently, right? A couple months ago to the public?
Correct. Yeah. We kind of launched silently commercially end of last year, and then we kind of started to actively welcome and onboard new therapists, new clinics per January. Right now we have about 300 clinics around the world. US, Canada, Europe.
300, you said?
Yeah, 300 clinics. Yeah. South America, India, even New Zealand, Australia. Yeah, it's pretty amazing how quick this is being picked up. The large majority of these clinics are ketamine clinics. Yeah, and this is, of course, as you are aware of, because many therapists want to work with NMDA psilocybin, but these are not available on the market yet. Ketamine is a licensed medicine, and people can start a ketamine clinic and offer psychedelic therapy with ketamine. So you see a lot of, so we are really at the heart of a lot of therapist trainings as well. So we see thousands of therapists going through these programs at the moment. And we see a lot of new clinics being opened up in these different continents. And then what we do is provide this platform to these clinics, and they range from really small kind of one therapist kind of private clinics, psychiatrists or psychoanalysts that kind of have a private practice of sorts, all the way to kind of larger multi-site clinics that have 10 or 20 or more clinics and more clinics to come.
And I'm curious to know, I mean, obviously you have 300 clinics using it and probably even more therapists. So obviously people want to use the product, but what is kind of, when you're having sort of these sales conversations, like, do people get it, or do people say, oh, why do I need Wavepaths when I have, my personal playlist that I've created over the years? Like, what is sort of the conversation like?
It's very different. Most people get it pretty quickly, I would say, because most people want to know what music to play, and they look at us for guidance, basically, for the music curation. What has been a surprise to learn for those people is that we have built this platform that allows them to make live music, and we don't offer these kind of fixed playlists. But then for people to really understand the value of live created music versus a fixed playlist, I would say that needs to come with experiencing it. In the same way, I think this is a very classical analogy. Back in the days when people were still driving horses from shop to shop and city to city, right? If you try to explain to an individual what it is to drive a car, right, people were laughing at you, not understanding you, and they were perfectly happy with how their horse was bringing them to the next city. This is really, I think, what's happening at this moment. This is a technology that has never existed before, and there's this educational gap that we're bridging. But we are seeing, as soon as people are picking this up and playing with it and working with it, that they are falling in love with it. Yeah.
That's amazing. So what kind of feedback do you get? Have you had any, obviously you get feedback that says we love Wavepaths. Have you had any sort of like interesting pieces of feedback that maybe either confirmed or made you question some of the academic foundations, or, maybe surprising pieces of feedback that you've taken from some of your customers?
Yes. And so this is really good and fun to be so close to the patient experience, much more than I was at the university, because I have so many data points coming in on a daily basis, so many patient experiences basically that we are supporting, and the feedback that we're getting from that is super rich. So we're spinning out new insights around music and psychedelic therapy on a weekly basis. We're testing multiple hypotheses on a weekly basis. And this is such a large question. There's so many of them. But to give you a few examples to kind of also illustrate how our own thinking has evolved around music, is our music in the beginning was less structured. It was pretty free flow. And it was very much inspired by Brian Eno's work around music for airports, ambient music, and also various ideas we are developing around how we can mimic nature soundscapes in music. And if you listen to a nature soundscape, if you're kind of in a forest, there's no clear pulse to how the birds sing. At the same time, there is this periodicity, there is this kind of rhythm of sorts, but it has a certain free flow to it. That was something we wanted to embody in the music. Now, the feedback that we got in the early days is, if a therapist I was interviewing said, if my patient is very dissociated and has a so-called high degree of ego disintegration, time is totally gone, right? The sense of self is totally gone. And there may be even fear associated with that process. Most of these use cases actually need structure. And so we developed this theory out of this, which we are just continuously expanding, that actually rhythm has a unique function to play. And that most likely if you kind of study traditional music, let's say the Amazonian traditions working with ayahuasca, you have some songs that are very rhythmless, that are more like a lullaby. But then you often have a lot of rattles and drums as well, and kind of a stable pulse to it. Most likely that is because the mind is losing its usual structure. And it needs to anchor a sense of structure and a sense of continuity in something else. And music is providing that structure and providing that sense of continuity in the experience in the absence of all of this. So without going into too many details here, we are actively studying rhythm at the moment, and it's really fun. We actually just released a new feature, which is called the percussive feature, where there's control over the types of drums, very soon the kind of BPM, the rhythms, and many different things. And really trying to understand how different types of rhythms and pulses and polyrhythms will basically influence the experience in the ways that you want as a therapist or as a patient.
Hey, that is so cool. Yeah, I think you're definitely right that having some kind of rhythm, whether it's percussive or not, can be pretty critical. You can definitely get lost in the nothingness if there's nothing there.
Yes. Yeah.
I've had some personal trips where the classic thing is you put the eye mask on, and I wanted to take that a step further, and I just put earplugs in, not headphones, but like earplugs, so like no music, no light. That's a very interesting state to be in. Yeah. Music is probably better to have in jet for most people, but
well, I think so. You are referring to Terence McKenna's recommendation to take
the dark room.
Yeah. I did the same in my 20s with mushrooms, and I was. The thing is, when I reflect back on that experience, I realized there is no silence. Right? When I had my earplugs in, I was listening to the sounds of my own body amplified. Right? My heartbeat and you.
Yes. And what's amazing is if you take enough, your body almost starts to create its own like songs within your mind based on heartbeat or maybe the sound of the air conditioner, rumbling or something. All sorts of strange auditory, like kind of, I don't want to say hallucinations, but almost like auditory hallucinations that can happen.
Sure.
Definitely recommended for those who are interested in exploring. You mentioned biofeedback. Is this something that is kind of incorporated now or something that you plan to incorporate in the future? And like, how do you plan to incorporate biofeedback? Because that to me is like the next level, super cool, like futuristic thing.
Yes. We are actively gathering data, both ourselves as well as with different partners we are working with. EEG, heart rate variability, breathing, you name it. There's lots of different kind of data points and data sets we are creating. And we are building predictive models out of that. So what can we say about the experience of the listener in this moment based on these different inputs? Now, this is a patent that we have not filed yet, so I cannot disclose too much about what's happening there. But this is exactly right. This is the next step in our technology development. We are developing this as we speak, and the next step is to integrate it into the software so that the care seeker can have something like, let's say, an Aura ring or a little band of sorts that is non-intrusive, but it still then provides the system feedback on biological variables. For the therapist, it's great to kind of monitor the heart rate and other things in the same screen. And at the same time, our music is also responding to it in different ways, more in the moment. So more and more over the coming years, our system will really grow into a state of maturity where it's really singing to you. And in the same way that, to our earlier example, the shaman will be singing to you, or the music therapist maybe making music with you in a moment. That's where we're growing into. That's kind of the midterm vision of what we are building.
Yeah, it's an amazing vision. I mean, not only can you adjust the music in real time to the biofeedback, but I imagine that it sort of creates this flywheel where as you gather data, you know what song was playing or what tone was playing. And so you can start to build up this database of, oh, this particular song with these settings causes people's heart rate to increase or causes people to get anxious, right?
Exactly.
And then that gives you a lot of predictive information about maybe what to play next.
Yeah. Yeah, and on top of that, the system can fine-tune itself in the moment. Right? In the same way that a singer may, again, change the intonation based on the feedback it's getting in the moment. Yeah, there's more of that immediacy.
So is Wavepaths right now primarily for use in clinics, or if some person who, does their own sort of psychedelic sessions in their house, is it something that they can use, or like kind of in a direct to consumer way? Or
yes, yeah, we are picking up a huge interest on that domain. For the sake of focus, we are not doing anything too large on that front, but we have a number of people on our platform that are paying the clinical price because they love this platform so much, and we're also kind of working with these individuals to fine tune how a consumer product may look like. We are
so it is
building
something that maybe will happen in the long run. Is a
we are building a native app as we speak, actually, and a very simple version at the beginning that is basically empowering people at their home to have access to music as a therapist, wherever they are, whatever they're feeling, and at the same time integrate that with the clinics we're working with, helping people to prepare at home through music listening experiences for the psychedelic therapy session that awaits them. And then they have their therapy session. The system even knows what this individual is most likely responding well to with the music. And then on top of that, the individual then is gifted the unique music created for this individual in this moment back home for integration purposes at home. So there's a loop there. We can refer to different clinics that are using Wavepaths, and there's an ecosystem that we're building on that front. But kind of to take a step back, what has always been the vision behind this enterprise is that it's not the drug that is the most important therapeutic agent. Funny enough, when you kind of look into the research, there are particular experiences that are most likely to facilitate change in one's life. And when you look at what those experiences are, they are primarily experiences that are really personally meaningful for the individual in this moment. So this idea of personal meaning making is really at the heart of what we believe the future of mental health care will be, with or without psychedelics. The future of mental health care will be more and more personalized, individualized, and will be more and more concerned with the question, how can we give this individual an experience that changes them, or an experience that supports this particular treatment program as an adjunct. Right? So the product that we have built has always been built with some kind of agnosticity in mind, being agnostic to its use case, being agnostic to even as a psychedelic therapist, agnostic to the training you are coming from. But you can then play with the instruments the way you want, in the same way that you are learning to play a guitar as you want. So what we're seeing at the same time is a huge interest from people being yoga teachers, breathwork facilitators, all sorts of different wellness retreats that are out there. We're even speaking with a very large hotel owner at the moment to think through how we can facilitate experiences as medicine in their hotel sections, in their hotel rooms. So the kind of business model of this enterprise has always been agile from day one, and not necessarily dependent or anchored only in psychedelic experiences, because I am pretty convinced, and needless to say, I'm putting a lot of my time, energy, and money in this, that the future of mental health care will be beyond psychedelics. It will be including psychedelics, but there are certain lessons that psychedelic therapy research is giving us that goes way beyond it. And music will be a very important component of that, without much doubt.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you decided to, leave academia and do a startup, because the startup world allows you to think in these broader terms, whereas
Yes,
academia
exactly.
forces you to like drill
Very
down
true.
into these very specific niches. Do you like, how do you like being a startup founder versus an academic? Are you loving it?
Well, in general, yes. Needless to say, in general, I absolutely love this, but it comes back and forth as a love-hate relationship at times, because it's also one of the most intense things I've ever done, and at the same time, the most rewarding thing I've ever done. Because totally to your point, if as an academic you are primarily creating ideas, right? You're building theories, you're sharing formal research reports, and that's it. Whereas I've always had a creative mind, let's say, that wants to go a step further, talk about practical implementations, dare to dream about how the future may look like of mental health care, of technology. So, yeah, building your own organization is giving you the freedom to manifest it into the world, build the team that can help to manifest it into the world. And that is absolutely, amazing to witness, for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. Let me ask you one other thing here. So, right now, sort of the gold standard for psychedelic therapy is you have the eye mask and you have the headphones on, right? There are a couple companies out there that are kind of saying that they're going to put virtual reality goggles on you and you're going to be looking at something that is going to guide you through a certain experience, almost like, wave paths for the eyes.
Mm-hmm.
Personally, the idea of wearing virtual reality goggles and looking at a screen during psychedelic therapy seems like torture to me. But that
Right.
might just be because I don't really like virtual reality in general. Maybe I'm like too old to get it. What do
Mm.
you think? Do you think that there's an analogy between being guided by music and being guided by, custom visuals? And do you think that virtual reality assisted psychedelic therapy will ever be a thing, or is that just people trying to shoehorn virtual reality into psychedelic therapy?
I think it's primarily the latter, to be honest.
Okay.
But that said, I am very much like you. I'm also personally biased. Like I've never had a virtual reality experience that truly convinced me. And even better put, most virtual reality experiences I had were pretty exhausting for my eyes and for my entire experience, and felt totally disembodying. Right? So that's one thing that I'm just very skeptical about. If you would bring it into a psychedelic therapy session, if it's misguided by incomplete or incorrect understandings of what the real therapeutic objectives are in psychedelic therapy, you may at your very best create a very beautiful experience for this individual, but that's not always necessarily therapeutic. So, and there's much more angles to this, but I always kind of emphasize here that what you want in any kind of experiential therapy, not only psychedelic therapy, but any therapy that has this experiential component that emphasizes how important it is to have this direct felt experience, is you want to have tools that guide the awareness into those experiences. If you study the masters of psychotherapy, Carl Rogers, Milton H. Erickson, you name it, they would always say something very similar in different ways, but they would always say one of the most important challenges you as a therapist in your therapy sessions is finding ways to influence the attention of the care seeker and guide it to there where most constructive resources are. Right. So if you play a beautiful film that may be, or a virtual reality experience, it may resonate and guide that process, but it can also move it away from it. So I'm not against this idea, but I think it can more easily become a distraction, because with music you at least have more freedom to again project your own inner world onto that event. Having said that, I am very much inspired by something I started to do only much later in my kind of psychedelic explorations, and that is taking a low amount of LSD and walking in nature. Albert Hoffman referred to this as medicine walks. Right? And I'm literally talking about 25 micrograms, not much more. And but what you already notice with these amounts is that the world around you becomes more metaphorical. It becomes more a part of the process you're experiencing, right? So, in a way, nature, and one may even extrapolate that, any kind of visual experience can be a very fruitful way to project parts of yourself and engage with the therapeutic process. That's not to be excluded. And at the same time, the I think the questions there are how can you make that again not too concrete? How can you kind of protect that level of abstraction that you see with music so profoundly? So yeah, I mean,
and I think there's a big difference between watching a video of trees in your virtual reality goggles and actually walking through the forest, right?
Totally,
where you're actually engaging,
totally.
where you have the freedom to turn this way and look that way, and walk forward and walk back and stop. And you also get all the smells and the wind on your face versus, it just seems like it wouldn't necessarily be the same. There's almost like some kind of like agency that you get by actually being able to engage with it versus being a passive observer. But who knows? Maybe this conversation may have inspired some young academic to maybe go down the path that you went down, but for virtual reality instead, just to prove us wrong.
Yes, so exactly. Would be great.
But yeah, that's the whole point of academia, right? Is like collecting data and just validating these things.
Yeah, and also as a startup, also as a company, we need to constantly test our assumptions and be challenged on those. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, Mendel, this has been a pretty amazing conversation. I know I've taken up almost an hour of your time, and I know you're a busy guy, so I want to let you go soon. But is there anything that I missed or anything that you want to kind of leave the listeners with?
Again, with those conversations, I always feel like we're scratching the surface. There's a lot of great kind of things this can lead into. I loved your comment about feeling nature at the very end and being outdoors and being in touch with the intelligence that nature has to offer. I do strongly believe that nature is also some kind of hidden therapist like music does. And there's lots of literature, academic literature, that already is kind of suggesting that in different ways. And I do think that psychedelic therapy at this moment in time is a cartoon version of what it will be in 10 years from now. But you're really at the beginning of something incredibly fascinating and novel, but filled with opportunities to be more innovative, be more ethical, to be more effective, all of that. At the same time, I also feel we are at a very vulnerable crossroad here in this industry. Like, it's very easy right now as well for things to go wrong. I think one of the biggest challenges that this field is facing is therapist training, is the quality of the human presence in the room. I think music can be a way to balance it out. I sometimes think even in that direction, if the therapist is a person that maybe is not qualified enough, if at least we have great music, the person has at least a better therapeutic opportunity. But at the end of the day, the individual presences in the room, whether it's in an individual context or in a group context, are so important to get right. And at the same time, something that we cannot rush too much. Right? If we apply the same approach to scaling a pizza delivery startup versus psychedelic therapy, I'm even coming to the conclusion that we want to be careful here with speed. And this is an ongoing, I think, dialogue that we need to have in this community, and how we can balance this in a way that really, really kind of leverages the best and minimizes the risk to the most in the best ways possible. So that's one thing that comes to mind to share.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right. I mean, I am an investor in the space, and one of the interesting things about investing, especially venture capital investing, is that you want to see these very high, like 10x returns, right? That's the proverbial venture capital mantra. But very few parts of the psychedelic value chain really should be scaled that way. Obviously something like Wavepaths, a software platform, can scale like that. But
that's correct.
Therapist trainings, even like clinics, don't necessarily lend themselves to that scale. And I think people trying to force them into that sort of scale can be damaging, not just to the people involved in the business, but to the industry as a whole, because it can really like weaken the quality of the people playing, and that can, who knows what sorts of downstream effects that could have.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So we've just got to be careful. But I do like what you said about, we are now at this place that is almost like a cartoon version of what psychedelic therapy will be like in 10 years. So let's aim for that future where the 10 years from now, psychedelic therapy landscape is, vastly improved from where it is now, and hopefully,
Totally. Yeah,
accessible to so many people. And it's an exciting time to be alive. Mendel, where can people find you online, and what's the best way for them to follow Wavepaths?
Wavepaths.com or Wavepaths on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or all the social media platforms as well. Yeah.
Awesome.
There's newsletters you can sign up as well.
Perfect. All right. Well, Mendel, thank you so much for your time. And we'll have to do this again sometime.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you so much for the interview. It was really fun.
Awesome, man. Cheers.